The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Many of the people who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what he had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the council and said, "What are we to do? This man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everybody will believe in him. And then the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was the high priest for that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all. Do you not understand that it is better for you to have one man die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed?" He did not say this on his own, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was about to die for the nation. And not for the nation only, but to gather into one the dispersed children of God. So from that day on, they planned to put him to death. Jesus therefore no longer walked openly among them, but went from there to a town called Ephraim in the region near the wilderness, and he remained there with his disciples. Now the Passover was near, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. They were looking for Jesus and were asking each other as they stood in the temple, "What do you think? Surely he will not come to the festival, will he?" The Gospel inspired by God. Most of us hear the Gospels being read in tiny little chunks, over a period of a few years. So it's very difficult for us sometimes to get a sense of the thrust of any one of them, the storyline. Let's say if you just took John's Gospel like we read today, and get a sense of the storyline of the whole Gospel, because we'll hear a passage today, and then we'll hear a passage next week, and then the week after it's from Mark's Gospel. We have Mark for a few weeks, and then it's Matthew. And so it's broken up, and we get no sense of the flow of it. So just this morning, as I was reading this passage, which is from John chapter 11, I suddenly realized that over 50% of John's Gospel takes place in the last week of Jesus' life. From chapter 11 to chapter 21, which is the end of the Gospel, it's all concerned with the last week of Jesus' life. And I began to realize that in this very last week, the week in which he would wind up dead, the very first act in that last week was the raising of a man from the dead. It's the story of Lazarus. It's the backstory to today. And the story is that Jesus had got a report. He was traveling and preaching, and he gets a report from his very close friends. There's a family called Mary and Martha and Lazarus who lived in a village called Bethany, a few miles from Jerusalem. And when Jesus came to Jerusalem, that's where he hung out. That was his bed and breakfast, himself and his disciples, every time he was near Jerusalem. So really good friends of his. And Mary sends him a report that her brother is seriously ill, Lazarus is seriously ill. And Jesus gets the report, and he says, he says to the apostles, his disciples, "Lazarus is seriously ill." But he delayed in wherever he was, and he didn't come back there. Finally, after a few days, he goes back there, and in the meantime, Lazarus has died. And Mary is really upset with him. She said, "We sent you a report several days ago that he was seriously ill. Why didn't you come back, and attend to him?" And so Jesus asks, where is he buried? And they bring him to a cave. And Martha said, "What are you going to do? He's stinking by now. He's dead for 4 days at this stage." And Jesus has them roll back the stone, and he calls out, "Lazarus, come forth." And this cloth figure shuffles out, all wrapped up in bandages. And he says, "Unwind him and set him free." So that's the beginning of the last week of his life. So he starts the last week of his life in which he's going to wind up dead at the end of the week, and he starts it by raising somebody from the dead. So it's sandwiched between these two events. Now, if you want to extend the week by just 3 days, you could say that it didn't just start with Lazarus' restoration to life, and end with Jesus' death. It started with Lazarus' restoration to life, and it ends with Jesus' resurrection, if you extend it out a few days. So the entire last week of Jesus' life is a resurrection sandwich, in which it begins with the resurrection of his friend Lazarus and ends with his own. So that's the first irony of it, that the last week begins with the resurrection and then ends with the death, or ends with another resurrection. So there's a difference, of course, between restoring somebody to life and resurrecting from the dead. So restoring Lazarus to life meant that at some stage, many years thereafter, Lazarus is going to die again. Whereas the resurrection of Jesus is a different order completely. So one of them is coming back from the dead, and the other one is going through death into another state of being. So it calls into mind then the difference between reviving or resuscitation, even somebody who's been pronounced clinically dead. And we know, for instance, that in our country here, over 15 million Americans, have been resuscitated, having been clinically pronounced dead. That the heart has stopped, breathing has stopped, and there's no brain activity, which are the three basic criteria. But that people who have been often for several minutes, and in some cases several hours, have been revived and brought back. There's a story, if you can get the body temperature actually just down to 90 degrees from 98.6, you can keep a dead body, you can revive it up to 8 hours afterwards. And there's a whole branch of medicine now devoted to that activity. But it's an art form and a science, bringing somebody, resuscitating. If you bring people back too quickly, there are consequences and they'll die again. And obviously if you keep restoring somebody to life, but you're not understanding the reason why they keep dying, you're bringing them back just to shock them, and they're back for a bit, and they die again, you bring them back. So it's a whole new form of medicine, resuscitation technology. But we know that many of these people, 15 million Americans have experienced near-death experiences where they've been pronounced clinically dead, but have come back and have reported what has happened on the other side. So what happens when you go through and continue? So that's the difference between the story of Lazarus and the story of Jesus. So it would have been very, very interesting to have interviewed Lazarus and asked him what was happening during those 4 days. What experiences were you having? And were you happy to come back, or would you have preferred not to have been resuscitated? So the resurrection is different, or resurrection is where you totally abandon the physical spacesuit and you begin to inhabit a different level of the body. And that's where, again, the Western model of body is so impoverished that we think the body is just this physical carcass, which has, a cardiovascular system and, a musculoskeletal system and an immune system and an endocrine system and a nervous system, that we're just this composition of a few different subsystems. In the Hindu model, there's this notion that we have a physical body, there's an energy body, which is vibrating at a higher frequency than that. There's an astral body, which is still higher. There's a mental body, there's a causal body, there's Atman, and there's Brahman, that there's all these different levels. And so resurrection is not about the restoration of the physical spacesuit. It's about moving through into a different level of body. And that's the big difference between Lazarus' experience and Jesus' experience. But there was a second irony that struck me this morning as I was reading this passage, and it was this. It was that the final straw, as far as the religious authorities was concerned, the thing that finally determined them, we need to kill this man, was the fact that he had raised somebody from the dead. I mean, what kind of logic is that? That they're upset with him for 3 years while he's preaching about the kind of his preaching, but the final straw that pushed him over the edge and said, we got to kill this guy, was the fact that he just raised somebody from the dead. I mean, what is the irony of that piece? Now, in fairness to the high priest Caiaphas at the time, it's a little bit more complex than that. To understand that, you have to understand Jewish history as well. Between 167 BC, when the Maccabees revolted against the Greek rule of the time, the Greeks had overcome the land of Israel, between 167 BC and 132 AD, which was the final Bar Kokhba revolt against Roman occupation of Israel, which was put down very, very, very viciously, and which in fact one of their leading rabbis was actually flayed alive and roasted in the sun. That was the end of the revolts against foreign occupation. So in that 300-year period, from 167 BC to 132 AD, there had been 32 armed rebellions against foreign rule in the land of Israel, 32 of them. And 31 of the 32 had started in Galilee, where Jesus was from. So any kind of popular movement, particularly originating from Galilee, would immediately come under the suspicion of the occupiers, any positive movement. And so here's the high priest saying, this guy is not just a blasphemer and a heretic, for his teaching, he's also a danger to the whole nation. Because if he gathers a really, really big following, the Romans are going to take note and they're going to suppress us, and we're going to lose the temple and we're going to lose our country completely. So it's important that this guy die, not just for theological reasons, but for political considerations as well. And it's interesting, John has a final twist to the story. Now, I don't know what it would sound like in Hebrew, but in the English translation we just heard, he says, the Caiaphas says, it is important that one man die for the nation. Now, there's two possible meanings for that in English. Either it is important that one man die instead of the nation, or one man die on behalf of the nation. And John twists it in today's reading. He goes from one meaning to the other. So the first meaning, Caiaphas is saying, it is better that one person die rather than the entire nation suffer. And John is saying he didn't realize he was actually making a prophecy. What he was really saying was, it's, this man will die not instead of the nation, but on behalf of the nation. So John was seeing it as a salvific act of Jesus on behalf of the Hebrew people, where the high priest was we're killing this guy to make sure the Romans don't kill the rest of us. So there's like ironies within ironies within ironies in today's story. And most of us never do. I mean, even the seminary, it was amazing, the seminary. I would have thought that seminary would be a place where you would literally, go through the Bible, get the history of it, the kind of the theology of it, the economics of it, and totally understand it. We didn't do that. In Bible's 8 years of seminary training, and they would pick out themes, like ridiculous kind of themes like realized eschatology. Eschatology is the kind of the study of the end times, and realized eschatology is what actually happens when you have the end times. So they'd pick out these themes like justice in Paul's letter to the Romans, but they never gave us a sense of the evolution of it, the history of it. These are things that I learned most of that myself by starting 4 or 5 Bible study groups in Palo Alto when I was working in the parish. And it was by having to study the material myself in order to teach it to others that I was actually learning it for the first time. But when we get in these tiny little bits and pieces, we lose so much of the story and the context. And that's why you read in the deep mystical literature that some of these really advanced, avatar figures, that they can maintain consciousness not just during the waking state and realize that this is a dream. It's a particular level of the dream. It's not the ultimate reality. But that when they're dreaming at night, they can dream lucidly. They know when they're dreaming at night that they're dreaming also, just as much as they know they're dreaming right now. But that even when they go into deep, dreamless sleep, they can still maintain an awareness. It's a contentless consciousness, but there's the awareness within that, just the pure awareness itself. So that at every stage of the dreaming process, the physical dreaming, the night dreaming, the dreamless dream, that at every stage of it, there is an awareness that survives and moves through that. And that can be a really frightening place. Somebody mentioned yesterday, was it you mentioned yesterday you had that experience? I remember having that experience on 3 occasions when I was living in Kenya. And the first time it happened, I woke up, I had no idea who I was, where I was, what I was, when I was. Total freak out. There was no ego. There's no constellating center of consciousness to hold a sense of the self. Really, really freaky. And I have no idea how long it continued. And then finally, somehow I realized, I'm Seán, I'm living in Kenya. It happened a second time a few years later, and equally freaky. But at the end of it, I decided, if this ever happens to me again, instead of freaking out and trying to break out of it, I'm going to see if I can just stay with it and see what happens. And it happened a third time. And the third time, somehow, there was some awareness that allowed me just to say, okay, I have no idea who I am, where I am, what I am, when I am. But in this, just this space, just stay there and see what happens eventually. And eventually, it dissolved, and a sense of separate self began to constellate again. But there was no fear in it the third time. So I imagine that something like that must be our death experience for some people, that the sense of separate self begins to dissolve. And it's really freaky, because our entire incarnation, we've been associated with a sense of physical being, with a name, with an accent, with a profession, with a location. And now all those have been stripped away, and there's no sense of separate self whatsoever. But there's some little voice, kind of a diminishing, almost non-existent ego that's freaked out by the experience. Now, I think that the same thing happens actually in little babies. Yeah, as mothers, you know that there's a qualitative difference to the cries babies make. Sometimes it's very obvious they're hungry. Sometimes it's very obvious they're cold or whatever. But there's a particularly plaintive cry that babies will sometimes make in the middle of the night. And my theory about it is this. If you've got a little baby, it's almost like it's in a sensory deprivation chamber. You know, it wakes up, the room is totally dark, it's getting no visual feedback, it's totally quiet, there's no auditory feedback whatsoever. The body is at room temperature, there's no kinesthetic feedback whatsoever. And so the bottle has fallen out of her mouth, there's no gustatory feedback, and there's no olfactory feedback. So literally the child is in a sensory deprivation chamber. And so there's no sense of, the little ego that's beginning to emerge has no sense of feedback from the environment, and it freaks out and screams its lungs out. Now, even the sound of its own voice at least connects it back up to one sense. And of course, immediately, Mommy is going to rush into the room, the light is going to come on, she's going to get embraced, so all the senses get activated once more, and the child can now relax. But I think that there's this awful moment for the child, and it's just newly arrived as a soul into this little spacesuit, of suddenly feeling, oh my God, I don't exist anymore, there's just utter nothingness around me, so I don't even know who I am. And that's a very special kind of sound that a little infant makes. So there's another literature as well which is very complementary to that, and it's literature on out-of-body experiences, that people can literally train themselves. There's even an institute back east, where you can be trained to do this, where you can dream lucidly and in the process detach your etheric body from your physical body and literally see your own physical body lying in the bed, but actually begin to travel either at an etheric level or an astral level. And some really interesting experimentation being done. It's called the Monroe Institute. You've heard about that? And so that literally you can access the different levels of body through training of various kinds. And part of that exercise is the realization that you can still view your physical spacesuit, but are no longer identified with it temporarily as you travel in a different level of the self. And so you're getting this information from near-death experiences, and you're getting it from out-of-body experiences, and you're getting from deep meditation. Yeah, all corroborating each other.